Atlanta pulsed with late summer humidity, which wrapped around your skin like memory. Warm, heavy, impossible to shake. Inside the Marriott Conference Center, chilled air and polite applause filled the grand ballroom. Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cuff of his slate-gray blazer, offering a reserved nod to another biotech investor whose name he wouldn't remember tomorrow. He had just finished delivering the keynote on medical device innovation and human-centered AI. The presentation was sharp, flawless even, just like the man giving it. Ethan was the kind of success story others wrote books about. Young, brilliant, self-made. CEO of Vitavance Technologies, a rising star in therapeutic robotics. But as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, the accolades faded like confetti after a parade. Temporary. Hollow. He didn't linger. He intended to return to the penthouse, order room service, and draft emails he wouldn't send. But instead, he found himself at the rooftop bar, drawn not by the bourbon or skyline, but by silence. And her. She stood near the edge, glass of ginger ale in hand, her navy blue scrubs almost absurd in contrast to the sequined cocktail dresses around her. But it wasn't the outfit that caught his attention. It was the stillness, like she belonged in the noise, but somehow moved beyond it. Ethan watched her from a polite distance, debating whether to speak. Before he could decide, she looked over her shoulder, meeting his gaze without flinching, without performing. "You don't look like you're enjoying the party either," she said, voice soft but clear. He blinked, caught. "I'm more comfortable in labs than lounges." "Same," she replied. "The only difference is that I usually hold someone's hand while they flatline." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "Layla Bennett," she offered, extending a hand with a grip firmer than expected. "ICU nurse at Mercy General, Ethan Caldwell," he replied, though the name likely preceded him. Her brow lifted. "The Ethan Caldwell?" He smirked. "Depends who's asking." Layla didn't laugh or gush. She turned back toward the skyline. "Even millionaires need to get away from panels sometimes, huh?" "Especially millionaires," he murmured. They talked. Not the kind of conversation meant to impress or seduce, but the kind that lingered. Her wit was dry, her eyes observant. She asked about his failed prototypes, not his successes. She admitted she hated night shifts, but loved the quiet of 3 a.m., when even grief whispered. 1 hour became 2. 2 bled into 3. By the time they left the rooftop, the city had gone silent under a curtain of soft rain. The hotel elevator ride stretched in charged silence. Not awkward, but electric, like they both knew what would happen and still chose not to speak it aloud. In his suite, it wasn't champagne or candles, no music, just the rustle of damp clothes hitting the floor and the hum of breath meeting breath. They didn't undress each other like lovers, but like strangers surrendering. There were no promises, no declarations, only warmth, skin, escape. And then, morning. The sun crawled through the windows like a truth no one asked for. Ethan stirred alone, sheets cool where she had once lain. No note, no goodbye, except for her hospital badge, left on the nightstand, tucked just beneath his folded dress shirt. Layla Bennett, RN, Mercy General. He stared at it for too long. He'd told himself it was just one night, but something about the silence she left behind refused to stay quiet inside him. What if one night wasn't the end of something meaningless, but the start of something he didn't dare name? Have you ever met someone who shook your soul in a single evening? If this opening chapter stirs something in you, don't let the feeling go quiet. Drop a comment. Have you ever had a night you couldn't forget, even when you tried? Like if you believe in unexpected beginnings. And follow us for part 2. Because some stories don't start with fireworks. They start with silence. The suite had returned to its usual order, pillows fluffed, curtains drawn, the espresso machine humming with quiet purpose. But something was off. For all his discipline and calculated composure, Ethan Caldwell couldn't let go of a single item that did not belong to him. Her hospital badge. It sat on the edge of his nightstand, half shadowed by a sunbeam filtering through the blinds. He hadn't moved it. Not because he forgot. Ethan never forgot. But because his fingers stalled every time he tried to tuck it away, as if hiding it meant admitting it had mattered. He told himself again that it was just a night, that what happened between them was a moment, nothing more. But his body betrayed him. He'd been sleepless since she left, rising with the sun, only to find the bed too wide, the air too still. In the mirror, his reflection looked unchanged. Same sharp lines, same steely jaw. The same cool intellect that had brokered seven-figure deals and steered medtech innovation through bureaucratic red tape. But something in his eyes had shifted, like he was staring out from a place that no longer fit. Layla Bennett stirred from an unrestful sleep across town in a modest walk-up behind an overgrown pharmacy. The apartment smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, the combination she always carried home from night shifts. Her scrubs, tossed over the back of a dining chair, still bore traces of that hotel's cologne, the faintest crease from the lapel of his blazer she hadn't meant to bring with her. She hadn't planned to leave without saying goodbye. But what could she have said? Thanks for seeing me? Thanks for not pretending I didn't exist? Or worse, see you never? Layla had never been the type to romanticize encounters. She dealt in the language of charts and heart rates, not fantasies. But her mind drifted since she slipped out of that suite before dawn. Not to the sex, though that memory clung, undeniably, but to his stillness. The way Ethan watched her made it seem like he was trying to memorize her face, not her body. To the way he'd touched her, not like she was fragile, but like he was. She hadn't told anyone, not her mother, not her best friend Camille, who would have demanded every detail, and then some. It wasn't shameful. It was preservation. Some moments belonged in silence, and this one, whatever it had been, felt too quiet and sacred to hand over to casual analysis. Still, it haunted her in strange ways. She misread a dosage at the hospital and caught it just in time. During lunch break, she forgot to eat. And when her colleague joked about getting drinks after the shift, Layla declined without thinking. She was tired, she said, but the truth was, her mind was elsewhere. Stuck in a suite where she had once laughed at something dumb he'd said, barefoot and wrapped in hotel linen, wondering what kind of man kissed your wrist like it meant something. 3 days passed. No texts, no calls. Not that she expected any. She knew men like Ethan. She'd seen them at the bedside of wealthy fathers or wives in rehab. They were brilliant, unreachable, built of pressure and precision. She didn't resent him for not reaching out. But that didn't stop her from checking her phone at every red light or pausing when she passed the hotel on her way home. She'd left something behind, too. Not her badge. Something more challenging to reclaim. And Ethan? He tried. He tried to bury himself in work. The Monday board meeting blurred into a pitch meeting that Tuesday, then a 3-hour R&D review that Wednesday. But even amidst talk of new FDA approvals and robotic-assisted post-surgical care, his thoughts wandered. He couldn't stop wondering where she was, whether she'd returned to someone, whether she thought of that night like he did, with reverent disbelief. He stood in front of the windows of his downtown office, overlooking the skyline he once dreamed of conquering. But the city looked less impressive than it used to. He couldn't stop thinking about Layla's appearance when she tilted her head and asked, without irony, "Do you ever wish you could shut it all off?" He had chuckled that night. But now, he understood. When his assistant knocked and entered with a folder, he didn't look up. "There's a breach," she said quietly. "Internal. Someone accessed proprietary beta data, early-stage files." Ethan turned. "From where?" "We're still tracing it, but the system flagged it at 2:14 a.m. last night. External IP address. Your name was used for admin override." He blinked. "Someone impersonated me?" She hesitated. "Or someone inside used your clearance?" For the first time in days, Ethan's pulse ticked up. A security breach of that scale could implode everything. The next-gen neuro interface he'd worked on for years. Investor trust, FDA cooperation. It wasn't just damaging. It was personal. And yet, as the team scrambled, as calls were made and passwords reset, Ethan wasn't thinking about the leak. He was thinking about Layla, about how unprotected he had felt in front of her, how vulnerable, how real, and how the quiet she'd left behind was louder than the chaos now filling every room around him. He stepped away from the war room, pulled out his phone, and stared at it. "I typed it once and erased it. Typed again. You left your badge. I think I left more." He didn't send it. Instead, he slipped on his coat and told his assistant to cancel the rest of the day. "Sir, what should I tell them?" she asked, confused. He paused at the door. "Tell them I remembered something important." And just like that, Ethan walked out into the Atlanta sun, the city roaring around him, while inside him, everything had gone quiet. The hospital didn't slow for long. It ticked forward in fluorescent light, with the rhythm of footsteps on tile and pagers that screamed rather than sang. Mercy General was always moving, its heart beating to the push of gurneys and the rise and fall of ventilators. Layla Bennett moved with it, or tried to. It had been a brutal shift. 2 code blues, 1 elderly patient who coded twice and came back only to fade again. A 12-year-old boy with a concussion and no parent to hold his hand. A domestic abuse survivor who flinched at every voice, even hers. By noon, Layla had been awake for 18 hours. Her ponytail drooped from beneath her scrub cap, and the ache behind her eyes pulsed like a second heartbeat. But she didn't stop. She never stopped. Compassion, for her, was a quiet language. It didn't need to be loud. It was in how she straightened blankets no one noticed, how she asked for preferred pronouns even when families scoffed. In a world that rushed to fix, Layla paused to feel. That was her real job. Not just charting vitals, but also making people feel seen in their most invisible moments. Still, even she had limits. She reached the nurse's station with a clipboard tucked under her arm, mind half-focused on the following dosage entry when she looked up, and froze. He was there. Ethan. Standing by the coffee machine, like a man who didn't belong in linoleum and antiseptic. His presence sliced through the mundane, like it had been waiting for this exact moment. He wore a dark coat over a black crew neck, his hair still slightly damp, as if he hadn't dried it properly. His hands were in his pockets, except for one holding a visitor badge clipped loosely to his belt loop. His name was printed there in bold, Ethan Caldwell. She blinked, sure she was imagining it. Inevitable fatigue had conjured him up. But then he looked at her, and whatever air she had left vanished. His eyes softened when they met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, a memory, a question, 1,000 things left unsaid. "Layla," he said, voice low, like a secret. She glanced around. Technicians passed. Monitors beeped. A child cried in triage. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, hugging the clipboard tighter. "I had to see you." The words weren't urgent, but they carried weight, as if he'd been practicing them, over and over, and now they sat there, unpolished, bare. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and led him into the nearest break room, an 8x10 closet with a microwave, a crooked poster of hand-washing techniques, and the faint scent of burnt popcorn. The door clicked shut behind them. They stood awkwardly at first, like strangers in a place only familiarity should occupy. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Neither spoke. Finally, he stepped closer. "I haven't stopped thinking about you," Ethan admitted, his voice softer now. "Not for a second." Layla didn't meet his gaze. Her fingers tightened around her ID badge as if to anchor herself. "You left," she said, barely audible. "You didn't say a word." "I know," he said, "and I've regretted it every hour since." She let the silence stretch until it frayed. "I told myself it didn't matter," she said eventually, "that it was one night, that people like you don't come back." "I almost didn't," he said truthfully. "I told myself I had too much to lose, too much to protect, but I realized I'd already lost something, and I didn't even know what to call it yet." Their eyes finally met then, and the break room, with all its fluorescent drabness and forgotten coffee cups, blurred into insignificance. Layla leaned back against the counter, exhaling through her nose. "I don't know what this is, Ethan." "It's messy," he agreed. "It's fast, and it's real." Her eyes flickered, unsure. Her body was steady, but her heart tilted toward the edge of something she didn't recognize. Or maybe, something she'd tried to forget she wanted. Then, without warning, she reached out, just enough to brush her fingers against his. The moment shifted. The room seemed to breathe with them. "Why now?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because you saw me before I explained myself, and that scared me more than anything has in years." They stood there, not touching except for the line of warmth between their fingertips. No one burst in. No one demanded their attention. They were just in a room that smelled like reheated lasagna and distant grief, and yet, it felt more intimate than the suite they'd once tangled in. Ethan wanted to kiss her, desperately, but he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he whispered, "May I see you again? Not for a night. For something that might become more." Layla didn't nod, but she didn't pull her hand away either. Later that afternoon, Ethan left the hospital through a side entrance. Rain had started again, soft, apologetic. As he stepped into his car, he looked down at his hand, still tingling from hers. Meanwhile, Layla leaned against the break room door, eyes closed, heart hammering in her chest. She could still feel the heat of his nearness, the restraint in his voice. And for the first time in years, the chaos of the hospital felt quieter, as if, somehow, the noise in her chest had found a rhythm again. One she wasn't ready to call love, but it was something real. The restaurant sat on the city's edge like a secret whispered only to those who listened closely. It wasn't trendy. There were no neon signs or rooftop terraces, just a weathered brick exterior and a faded wooden door. Inside, warm lamplight spilled across linen tablecloths, and the muted clink of glass met soft jazz. It was the kind of place that didn't care about the noise of the world outside, and that was precisely why Ethan chose it. He arrived early. Too early. The hostess led him to a quiet corner table, half shielded by a partition of trailing ivy. He sat down, ordered still water, and immediately regretted not asking for something more substantial. His hands, typically so steady, betrayed a faint tremor as he unfolded the napkin across his lap. It wasn't nerves exactly. It was the weight of wanting something to go right for once, and knowing he had no blueprint for it. Layla hadn't said yes immediately when he asked her to dinner. She looked at him for a long moment, steady, unreadable, and said, "Text me when you know where." That was 2 days ago. Now, every sound in the restaurant, the shuffle of menus, the cork popping from a bottle, sounded louder than it should. His gaze kept flickering to the door until, finally, it opened. She stepped in, and the world quieted. Layla wore a black dress that didn't shout for attention, but refused to be ignored. It was simple and elegant, and the fabric caught the light in soft folds. Her hair was pinned loosely, and a few strands fell along her neck like afterthoughts. But Ethan had never seen anything more deliberate. He stood as she approached, unsure if he should reach for her or wait for a cue. She gave him neither, just a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he replied, a touch breathless. As they sat, the air between them settled into a strange tension, not hostile, not awkward, but charged with everything unsaid. They both reached for their water glasses simultaneously, then paused, laughed once, softly, and finally let silence sit beside them. "I've never been here before," Layla said, glancing around. "It's quiet," Ethan replied. "I thought maybe we both needed quiet." Her eyes met his for the first time that night. "That's not something I usually get. I know the feeling." They spoke slowly at first, careful as if stepping across a frozen pond, testing each word for cracks. He asked about her patients, and she told him a story about a child who insisted on singing every time he got a shot. She asked about his work, and he answered, but not with polished sound bites or corporate metaphors. He spoke plainly, admitting frustrations, admitting he didn't always feel like the genius people claimed he was. Layla listened. She always listened like it was her first instinct, not just to hear, but to understand. The waiter came and went, unnoticed. Plates were brought, untouched. The food was good, but irrelevant. Then, halfway through a pause that felt like breath being held, Ethan exhaled. "I didn't bring you here just for dinner," he said. Layla stilled. "I figured." He leaned forward, hands clasped lightly on the table. "There's something I need to say, before I talk myself out of it again." Her eyes didn't flinch. She just waited. "I'm infertile," he said quietly. The words landed like a dropped stone. Not loud, but final. Layla didn't move, didn't blink. "I was diagnosed at 27, Ethan continued, voice even, but low. "I've had relationships end because of it. Some never even began. People want legacies. I understand that. Unlike most people imagine, I've built an empire but can't build a family." Layla's hands rested in her lap. Her shoulders were still. The candle between them flickered, casting shadows across her cheekbones. "It's not something I advertise," he said. "And I'm not saying this to earn sympathy. I wanted you to know before I asked you anything more." Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but thick with meaning. Then Layla reached for her glass, took a slow sip, and set it down gently. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, voice soft but firm. Ethan nodded once, unsure if it was acceptance or deflection. "And just so you know," she added, her gaze steady now, "I've never wanted children because they're expected. I've only ever wanted them if they were loved. That's what matters." Her words hit harder than he expected. He looked down, the air catching in his throat. After a moment, she added, "You still haven't said what you wanted to ask me." Ethan looked up. His expression was open now, unguarded. "I don't have a script," he admitted. I'm used to contracts and algorithms and knowing the next 3 steps. But with you, I have nothing rehearsed. I only know that I don't want this, whatever this is, to end. Layla leaned back slightly, folding her arms. Not defensive, just thoughtful. We barely know each other. I know, he said, and still, I trust you more than anyone in years. The words settled between them like dust and light. Real. Undeniable. I'm not offering you a fantasy, Ethan said. I'm not asking for one either. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something real with me. No timeline, no conditions. Layla looked at him for a long moment, trying to determine where the truth ended and hope began. I don't do fairy tales, she said. Neither do I. She smiled then, just slightly. But this time, it reached her eyes. They didn't toast, didn't lean across the table for a kiss. They just sat in quiet understanding, the kind that didn't need music or declarations. Outside, the city hummed beneath a velvet sky, unaware that inside a corner table in a forgotten restaurant, 2 people had just stepped into something unscripted. And, for the first time in a long while, entirely accurate. The loft was nothing like the luxury Ethan Caldwell usually surrounded himself with. There were no marble floors, sweeping staircases, or recessed lighting designed by European architects. Instead, string lights were pinned lazily across ceiling beams, a row of mismatched chairs borrowed from friends, and a record player spinning softly in the background, scratching its way through an old jazz tune nobody had picked, but everyone seemed to love. And in the center of it all stood Layla. She wore ivory silk, bare shoulders, bare feet. Her hair was coiled in a loose chignon that had started to fall in the August heat, and her fingers gripped a folded piece of paper so wrinkled it might have disintegrated if she breathed too hard. Ethan was already waiting, standing beneath the arch of dried eucalyptus and simple linen. His suit wasn't tailored. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top. He looked completely out of place, yet entirely confident, like this was the only moment in his life where he wasn't performing. There were 10 people in the room, no more, no less. No friends who had become family, colleagues who had refused to watch from a distance. Layla's mother sat near the front, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief that had once belonged to Layla's grandmother. Renee, Layla's best friend, stood beside her, holding the bouquet because Layla had forgotten it in the car and decided it didn't matter. This wasn't a wedding designed for photographs. It was a moment designed for memory. The officiant, a quiet woman named Simone, who had been a nurse for 30 years before becoming ordained, asked the room to fall silent. Ethan cleared his throat once. Then, he looked at Layla, still surprised she was real. I didn't believe in destiny, he began, voice steady but not rehearsed. I believed in design, in strategy, in causality. But then I met a woman who didn't need to fix or complete me. She stood beside me, without explanation, and suddenly, all my data felt irrelevant. He paused. I don't know how to promise perfection, Layla, but I can promise presence. I can promise to stand with you when it's inconvenient, to learn you again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Layla's eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. She unfolded her crumpled slip of paper and smiled at how little was written. I thought love was a luxury I couldn't afford, she said quietly, something reserved for people who hadn't learned to survive independently. But then you looked at me, not like I was saving or healing you, but like I was already whole. She swallowed. I can't promise ease. I've never known ease. But I can promise the truth. And I promise I'll meet you there, wherever the truth is, even when we're exhausted. No one clapped. No one cheered. Only the stillness reverberated through the ribs, the silence that wasn't empty, but overflowing. When they kissed, slow, reverent, a promise more than a performance, it didn't feel like a culmination. It felt like a beginning. That night, long after the music had faded and the last slice of lemon cake had disappeared from its paper plate, Layla stood in front of the full-length mirror in their bedroom. Her gown was half unzipped, her skin soft with candlelight and memory. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't posing. She was just still, as if absorbing the enormity of what they'd just stepped into. Behind her, Ethan's reflection appeared. He was shirtless, his expression unreadable. He gently touched her waist and leaned in until his forehead rested against her shoulder. "You're mine now," he murmured, not as possession, but as prayer. She turned slowly, their bodies aligning not out of habit, but out of something older than either of them could name. "No more hiding," she whispered. "No more pretending it doesn't matter." He lifted her with surprising gentleness and carried her to the bed, not in haste, but reverence. There was no urgency on their wedding night, no grand choreography of passion, just the unhurried rhythm of discovery, the quiet awe of two people touching without expectation, only intention. His hands moved slowly, learning her all over again, while hers gripped his shoulders not to possess, but to steady. They didn't speak. Words would have broken something delicate. They kissed. They breathed. They unraveled. When their bodies finally stilled, skin pressed to skin, heartbeats matching beneath shared breath, Ethan kissed her temple and whispered, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Layla's eyes fluttered shut. For the first time in years, she believed it. They fell asleep like that, entwined, undivided, not because they were trying to prove something, but because they no longer needed to. And somewhere beyond the windows, the city exhaled with them, quiet, steady, holding its breath for what would come next. 3 days after the quiet wedding, the world found out. It began as a whisper, a vague mention on a local Atlanta blog about an unexpected union between a medical tech mogul and a hospital nurse. No photos, just speculation. Layla thought it might die quietly, swallowed by the noise of everything else happening in the world. But it didn't. By the end of the week, her phone buzzed with notifications she hadn't signed up for. Her email was filled with media inquiries. The hospital's HR department called her in just for a chat, asking whether she had any concerns about optics. She laughed, softly and without humor, and said no, because even if she did, there wasn't much to say. She'd married someone she loved, not someone she marketed. The headlines escalated quickly, as they always do. From scrubs to silk. Who is Ethan Caldwell's new wife? Millionaire marries ICU nurse in secret ceremony. What's she hiding? Is this real love or a PR move? They dug into everything. Her childhood indicator, her college financial aid. Her Instagram account is long dormant. Photos of her in her early 20s, laughing with friends, suddenly plastered next to shots of Ethan in boardrooms. The contrast made good television. Some called her lucky. Others are opportunistic. Some said she was the reason Ethan had gone quiet after such a dominant streak in tech. But the most challenging part wasn't the media. It was the ordinary moments that no longer belonged to her. Stepping out to grab coffee and seeing a camera peeking behind tinted glass. I was asked for a comment while checking out at the grocery store. Hearing her name mispronounced on a podcast made me feel like she was an accessory rather than a person. At Mercy General, things changed too. Some colleagues smiled too widely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A nurse she once trained now called her Mrs. Caldwell, in a tone that didn't sound like admiration. She didn't tell Ethan everything. He had enough on his plate, divesting a portion of his company to a nonprofit, fielding interviews about the next Vitavance prototype, trying to shift his public image from brilliant but distant to genuine and present. But one evening, she broke. It was late, well past midnight. The apartment was quiet. She was perched on the edge of the kitchen counter, knees pulled to her chest, still in her scrubs. The microwave clock blinked 1:12 a.m. Ethan walked in, rubbing his eyes, shirt half-buttoned. He paused when he saw her. "Layla," he said gently. She wiped her cheek quickly. "Hey." He crossed the space between them in 3 strides. "Talk to me." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, eyes raw, not angry or sad, just tired. "It's a lot," she whispered. He placed his hands on her knees, grounding her. "I know." "I thought I was ready for this," she murmured, voice catching. "But I didn't expect to feel erased." His jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. "I walk into a room and I'm not Layla anymore," she continued. "I'm a headline, a discussion point, a woman someone like you shouldn't have married." He looked up at her. "To me, you're not erased. You're more visible than anyone I've ever known." "I don't need the world's approval," she said, "but I didn't realize how cruel people can be when they think you don't belong." Ethan didn't rush to answer. He just rested his forehead against her legs and exhaled. Then he looked up and said, "You belong with me. That's all that matters." Her tears came quietly, not from sadness, but from the exhaustion of pretending none of it touched her. He kissed her then, not with desire, but with reverence, tasting the storm she'd been holding in. That night, they didn't leave their bedroom. They didn't talk about the articles or the cameras. They held each other as if touch could stitch them back together. It wasn't passion that moved between them, but insistence, the need to remind each other, we're still us. But comfort, no matter how deep, doesn't stop the world from knocking again. A week later, they attended a private gala hosted by one of Ethan's longtime investors, a charity event under chandeliers and champagne. Ethan had asked if she wanted to go, and she said yes, wanting to prove she could. Layla wore midnight green, understated but elegant. Her mother had helped her pin her hair back. Renee had lent her earrings. She looked like herself, only polished. They entered arm in arm. For the first hour, it went well. They mingled with designers and diplomats. Ethan introduced her with the ease of someone proud, not performative. But then came the whisper. She didn't see who said it, only caught the tone, sharp and syrupy, just loud enough to be heard. "She's beautiful," the voice said, "but she doesn't look like she belongs here." Ethan heard it too. His hand on Layla's waist tightened, but she smiled politely, excused herself, and slipped out to the balcony. The night air was cooler than expected, laced with honeysuckle and exhaust. She placed both hands on the railing and tried to breathe. A moment later, the door creaked open behind her. "You okay?" Ethan asked. She didn't turn. "I just needed air." He stepped beside her, close but not pressing. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly. "Anything." She shook her head. "I need to not feel like a novelty, like someone's pet project. You're not." "I know what I am to you," she cut in, her voice soft but clear. "But I don't know what I am to them, and it's starting to seep into what I believe about myself." He was silent. Then he said, "Then let's rewrite the story." She finally looked at him. "How?" "I don't know yet. But I'll start by making sure the only person who gets to define you is you." Layla didn't answer. She just leaned into him, resting her cheek against his shoulder. And in the distance, the sounds of the gala continued. Soft music, forced laughter, the clink of crystal. But out there, under a moon that couldn't care less about headlines, two people stood close enough to feel real again. And that was something the world couldn't take. The elevator doors slid open with a low chime, revealing the top floor of an old brick building in the heart of Atlanta, far removed from Ethan's penthouse, or any address the tabloids might care to follow. The air carried no hint of perfume or politics, just wind, and the scent of city heat settled over rusted railing and concrete warmed by the sun. Layla stepped out first, her heels clicking softly as she looked around. There was nothing extravagant about the rooftop, just strings of mismatched bulbs looped across beams, a few worn lounge chairs, a small wooden table with 2 glasses and an unopened bottle of wine. Above them stretched a sky bruised by dusk, not yet dark, but no longer bright. She turned toward Ethan, one eyebrow raised. "This isn't your usual aesthetic." "That's the point," he said, setting the wine down and pulling off his blazer in one motion. "No press, no partners, just the skyline and 2 people. The world keeps trying to fit into the wrong story." Layla crossed her arms. "And the wine? I remembered you said red makes you sleepy." "So, white." Her mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. She walked to the rooftop's edge and leaned over the railing, taking in the city she knew more intimately than any GPS could. Behind her, Ethan poured the wine. He watched her, silently. She looked peaceful, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the tired you can't sleep off type that doesn't come from work, but from holding it together. When she turned back toward him, her face was unreadable. "Do you ever get tired of defending us?" "I don't defend us," he said. "I defend you. The rest of the world can think what it wants." She walked over, took the glass from his hand, and sipped. The wine was cold and crisp. Not her favorite, but he'd remembered. She appreciated that more than she let on. "You know," he said quietly, "I didn't bring you here just to hide. I brought you here to kiss you somewhere the world wouldn't interrupt." Layla looked up, eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the gravity in his voice. "So that's what this is? An escape?" He hesitated. "No. It's a return." To what? He didn't say. But she understood. She stepped into him, slowly, as if crossing some invisible threshold. And when he kissed her, finally, it wasn't desperate. It was deliberate. Like every moment leading up to it had been counted and considered. They didn't rush. Didn't press into one another, like they were trying to forget something. Instead, they stood there, framed in golden light, sharing breath, while the hum of the city fell away. When they pulled apart, her forehead rested lightly against his. "You're not who I expected," she whispered. "I'm not who I used to be," he replied. Later, the wine bottle sat nearly empty, glasses abandoned on the ground. Layla had kicked off her shoes, and Ethan had rolled his sleeves halfway up his arms. They danced, barefoot, without music, guided only by heartbeat and wind. Neither of them laughed. It wasn't playful. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was reverent. The kind of slow sway that meant, we're still here. They didn't need a melody, just proximity. At one point, Layla closed her eyes and pressed her ear to his chest. "It's quieter up here." He nodded. "No one is watching. No one judging." "No," she said. "I meant you. You're quieter." He didn't respond right away. He pulled her a little closer, his fingers tightening briefly at the curve of her waist. "You make the noise stop," he said. That silenced even the air between them. Long after the sky had turned ink blue and the city lights blinked like distant stars, they curled together beneath a throw blanket Ethan had kept in the trunk of his car for reasons he never could explain until now. They lay on the rooftop floor, limbs entangled, bodies warm from more than wine. And when he kissed her again, longer this time, slower, it wasn't to erase what had been said. It was to confirm it. They didn't talk about the gala, the whisper, or the echo of strangers who would never know them. They didn't speak of reputation or legacy or the weight of unwanted attention. Instead, they kissed like a kind of defiance. They made love with the patience of people who knew the world could unravel at any moment, but refused to be hurried by it. Every touch was intentional. Every exhale is deliberate. Ethan's hands explored her like memory, not hunger. And Layla, in return, gave herself without hesitation, not because she'd forgotten the pain, but because she'd decided to stop letting it decide. They moved slowly, breathily, as if aware that even up here, far above the noise, time would still try to steal something from them. But time, that night, didn't win. Neither spoke when they stilled, chests heaving in tandem, fingers threaded. There was no need, because for the first time in weeks, the narrative didn't belong to anyone else. Not the blogs, not the headlines, just them, on a rooftop where no one clapped, where love didn't need applause to be real. The rooftop lingered in their bones long after they left it. Back in the rhythm of everyday life, Layla resumed her shifts at Mercy General, her schedule threaded with long hours and the ever-present scent of antiseptic. She returned to patients who needed her, to colleagues who now tiptoed around her presence, unsure whether to whisper or smile too hard. She chose to stay quiet, not because she was ashamed, but she needed silence to understand what the noise had changed in her. Meanwhile, Ethan buried himself in work, if only to prove, perhaps to himself, that loving someone hadn't weakened him. But in the blur of emails and beta tests, he felt the friction, tiny grains of tension collecting in the corners of his company, like dust no one wanted to name. At first, it was subtle. A skipped CC on a product launch email, a board meeting where his voice was heard but not answered. Then, he hadn't noticed that a quarterly report was missing 3 pages, which wasn't discovered until after it had been distributed. He didn't think much of it. Distraction was easy to blame. Until one morning, during a Foundation press interview, Layla's name came up. It was innocent. Just a journalist asking about the inspiration behind the Foundation's new healthcare outreach. Ethan smiled and spoke her name clearly, unapologetically. But across the room, his CFO shifted. Uncomfortable. Avoidant. Later, Ethan reviewed the footage and the room's expressions. Not because he doubted himself, but because something about that moment had stuck. And then came the anonymous tip. It landed in the inbox of a tech blog notorious for walking the fine line between gossip and exposé. The headline read like clickbait, but the implications were knife-sharp. Medical fraud? Source claims. Ethan Caldwell altered health records to secure grant. The article was riddled with speculation. It hinted that Ethan had falsified fertility documents to appear eligible for certain biotech partnerships, and suggested Layla had left her last hospital due to unresolved patient care disputes. None of it was true. But truth and perception rarely move at the same pace. In less than 24 hours, the story spread. Social media whispered. Investors questioned. A public relations firm sent 3 separate drafts of a denial before Ethan even sat down with his legal team. Layla found out the same way Ethan did, through a forwarded message from a nurse she barely knew, punctuated by a clumsy, "Are you okay?" She didn't reply. Instead, she went home early. No makeup, no armor. Just exhaustion tucked under her skin like a second layer. When she walked into the apartment, Ethan was already pacing. His phone lay face down on the kitchen counter, buzzing every few minutes like a metronome set to chaos. "What happened?" she asked. He didn't look up right away. Then, finally, "Someone went after us." Her jaw tightened. Define "went after." He met her eyes, and something in his own had broken. Not shattered, but bent. "False reports," he said. "Your work history, my medical past, all of it. Public now." She stood there, still holding her bag, as its weight landed. "They're saying I seduced you for money," she said slowly. "That I got pregnant to secure your name." He flinched. "You're not—" "I'm not pregnant," she said quickly. "But they don't care. They want a headline." The silence that followed was not empty. It was loud with everything unsaid. Ethan turned away, fingers dragging through his hair. "Colin did this." Layla frowned. "Colin?" "Colin Reese," he said through gritted teeth. "My old roommate, business partner, best man at our wedding." She blinked. He knew about the diagnosis. "He knew everything," Ethan said. "And he sold it. I traced the source. He's behind the leak." Layla let the words settle. "What are you thinking?" he asked, voice lower now. She walked to the couch and sat slowly. "That this is what I feared." He moved toward her. "Layla." "No," she said gently. "I gave up my peace to be with you, and I would do it again. But I need to know something." He knelt in front of her, searching her face. "Am I a part of your life?" she asked, "or just a beautiful footnote you hoped would stay quiet?" The question didn't come with venom. It came with the ache of someone who'd spent years building herself and feared becoming a footnote in her own story. Ethan's throat tightened. He thought of every time he hadn't introduced her to the board. Every time he had let someone mispronounce her name, he didn't correct them. Every time he had pulled her close in private, but hadn't defended her loudly enough in public. And now she was the one being torn apart, not him. That night, she packed a small bag. She didn't scream, didn't threaten. She kissed him gently on the cheek, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment longer than necessary, and whispered, "I need space to remember who I was before they tried to rewrite me." Then she walked out. And Ethan didn't stop her, because in that moment, he realized love wasn't just about holding on. Sometimes it was about letting someone walk far enough away that they could choose to come back, or not. Rain pressed against the windows like breath-fogging glass, soft but relentless, turning the city into a watercolor of grays and silvers. Ethan sat in the center of the penthouse, surrounded by stillness. The space, once filled with her rhythms, her humming in the kitchen, the rustle of her jacket thrown over the couch, the subtle way she exhaled when reading, was now stripped to its pristine silence. He hadn't moved her things. Her coat was still on the back of the dining chair. Her favorite mug sat on the windowsill, with the tea stain she'd never scrubbed out. He didn't touch any of it, not because he hoped she'd come back, but because touching it felt like admitting she might not. Layla had been gone for 13 days. She hadn't texted and hadn't called, and he hadn't reached out either, not because he didn't want to, but because she'd asked for space, and Ethan had never wanted to be the reason she couldn't breathe. But the silence wasn't still. It was alive, It moved with him, into meetings, the shower, into bed at night, when he instinctively reached for the shape that wasn't there. He had thrown himself into work at first, filed legal action against the outlet that published the leak, terminated his partnership with Colin Reese, and issued a formal internal investigation. He even went public, standing in front of a row of cameras and saying in a voice stripped of corporate polish, "Yes, I am infertile. Yes, I kept it private. No, it doesn't make me ashamed. And no, my wife had nothing to gain from marrying me. Except, perhaps, the burden of carrying a name that came with a target." The statement went viral, not because of its scandal, but because of its sincerity. But none of it felt like enough, because she was still gone. Layla, meanwhile, stayed in a friend's spare apartment over in Inman Park, a converted attic with low ceilings and creaky floors. Renee had offered the space without question, asking once, "Do you need me to tell him where you are?" Layla had just shaken her head. Not yet. She worked long shifts, let herself get lost in patient charts and steady bleeps of monitors. She cooked small meals, but she didn't always eat. Sometimes she painted, though the brush often paused mid-stroke as her mind wandered back to things she hadn't said. Like how she'd never once questioned his infertility. Like when she left, she wasn't walking away from him, only from the version of herself that had been reduced to someone else's narrative. On the 13th night, she sat on the couch, a blanket pulled to her chin, when her phone buzzed. Not with a call, not with a message, just a calendar reminder. 1 month since the wedding. Her breath hitched, and somewhere, across the city, Ethan sat on the floor of their bedroom, holding the small note she had once tucked inside his jacket pocket the morning after their wedding. "You don't have to be perfect. You have to be honest." He stared at the ink like it could answer for him. Then he stood. The drive took 14 minutes. He didn't bring flowers, didn't plan a speech. He didn't even know if she'd be there. But when he stepped out of the car, soaked from the rain and unbothered by it, something in his chest felt steadier than it had in weeks. Layla opened the door wearing one of his old t-shirts. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes wide with surprise. For a second, neither of them moved. The rain behind him fell harder, slapping the pavement in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Ethan, I was wrong," he said, cutting gently into the space. She blinked. "I thought protecting you meant keeping you away from the parts of my life that hurt," he said. "If I kept you separate, I could shield you from the worst of it." He took a step closer. "But that wasn't protection. That was fear. And it made you feel alone in something we were supposed to share." Layla didn't speak. Her hand tightened around the doorframe. "I should have stood beside you," he said, voice thick. "Not in front of you. Not behind you. With you." Silence wrapped around them like fog. Then he whispered, "I don't want to be the man who hides. I want to be the man who shows up, who says your name out loud in every room, even when it costs me everything." Her lips parted, but no sound came. So he did the only thing left to do. He stepped closer, soaking wet, heart bare, and placed her hand on his chest. "Feel it," he murmured. "This doesn't beat the same without you." And with that, something inside her cracked. The tension, the fear, the voice that kept whispering she didn't belong. Gone. She reached for him, not delicately, but all at once, like someone tired of pretending she didn't ache. Their lips met in the doorway, clumsy and fierce. She pulled him inside, fingers tangled in his damp shirt, his hands holding her like a man who had almost lost everything. They didn't speak. They undressed each other without ceremony, shedding layers of silence and restraint. They fell onto the couch, skin against skin, not out of lust, but urgency. Her nails scraped his shoulder blades. His mouth moved down her neck like a prayer. It wasn't polished. It wasn't slow. It was raw. Forgiveness, unspoken. Hope, resurrected. When they stilled, chests heaving, she cupped his face and whispered, "Don't hold back." And he didn't. They made love repeatedly, not to reclaim what had been lost, but to build something new. Every kiss was an anchor. Every breath is a promise. No performance, no facade. Just Layla and Ethan, stripped of everything except the truth. Later, wrapped in a blanket, limbs tangled on the couch, he tucked her hair behind her ear and asked quietly, "Can we start over?" She traced his jaw with her thumb and said, "We don't have to. We never stopped." And in the hush that followed, the storm outside softened, no longer a threat, just weather. Because inside, they'd found each other again. And this time, it wasn't about staying quiet. It was about choosing to be heard. Morning came slowly, sifting through half-closed blinds, like a secret too tender to speak aloud. Layla woke to the feel of Ethan's arm wrapped securely around her waist, their bodies still intertwined beneath the crumpled throw blanket on the couch. She didn't move. Not yet. Her head remained tucked beneath his chin, her breath rising and falling in rhythm with his chest. Outside, the city stirred with its usual noise. Car horns, delivery trucks, the faint call of birds attempting to outshine traffic. But time had slackened, thickened, and grown deliberately within these four walls. Ethan stirred just as she shifted to face him, eyes half-lidded, voice low and husky with sleep. "You're still here," he murmured. "I didn't dream it," she replied. He offered a small, crooked smile. If it were a dream, it would have gone much smoother. She chuckled softly, running her fingers through his hair, still damp at the roots. Before the armor and rolls returned, something was fragile about him in the morning. She liked him best like this, unfiltered, still healing. They didn't talk much that morning. Words felt secondary. They showered, separately, but slowly, and made coffee in silence, trading glances like punctuation. She found one of Renee's oversized sweaters to wear. He put on the t-shirt she'd slept in, now carrying her scent. By late afternoon, they sat on the floor, backs against the couch, 2 mugs of untouched coffee growing cold beside them. Layla stared ahead, her hands resting in her lap. "Do you think people ever stop needing to prove themselves?" she asked quietly. Ethan turned his head toward her. To whom? To everyone. The world. The people who think we don't belong. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers between hers. "I don't think the world ever stops asking us to," he said. "But I think we stop caring when we start defining ourselves without it." She looked at him, eyes clear. "And have you?" His smile was faint. "I'm working on it." She nodded, squeezing his hand. "Me too." That night, Ethan brought her home. Not to the penthouse, not yet. That space still held too much noise. Instead, he brought her to a quiet rooftop garden in Midtown, an old property he'd purchased years ago but never developed. It was peaceful, worn, and beautiful in its neglect. The city surrounded them, but from here, it didn't loom. It hummed. He'd brought a blanket, 2 glasses, no speech. They sat beneath the stars, real ones for once, faint through the light haze, but undeniably there. Layla curled into his side, her head resting against his shoulder. "Why here?" she asked softly. "Because it's a place I forgot I owned," he replied. "And because you make me want to remember the parts of me I've ignored." She tilted her head, curious. I used to dream in places like this, Ethan said. Before the company, before the noise, when it was just me and an idea, and the hope that I might build something that mattered. You did, she said. Maybe, he murmured. But I think I forgot that people matter more. She reached up, brushing his cheek with the back of her hand. You didn't forget. You just needed someone to remind you. They kissed then, not like people making promises, but like people honoring them. That week, Ethan stepped away from 3 high-profile speaking engagements. He quietly withdrew from a potential merger that would have doubled his valuation, but demanded public performances he no longer wished to give. Instead, he announced the formal launch of a new branch within his foundation, the Bennett Initiative. It would fund mental health resources for nurses and first responders across the Southeast, with Layla helping to shape its outreach. At the press conference, she didn't speak. She stood beside him, calm and confident, her hand gently resting at her side. When someone asked why the initiative bore her name, Ethan said, "Because I married a woman who gives herself to everyone, and it's time someone built something that gives back to her." The reporters didn't prod. They didn't need to. In private, Layla told him he didn't have to do that. "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." She didn't thank him. She just kissed him. Not as a reward, as recognition. Weeks passed. Layla didn't return to full-time work, though the hospital left the door open. Instead, she chose a community clinic in West End, where her hands could still heal and her heart could move more slowly. She painted again, not for anyone but herself. The attic of Renee's place had become a temporary studio, cluttered with canvases and color. Sometimes, Ethan would quietly watch her from the doorway, like someone watches rain fall after a drought. One evening, he came home to find her crouched on the floor, smudges of cobalt blue on her cheek, staring at a canvas she'd left unfinished for weeks. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat beside her, careful not to disturb her silence, and offered his presence like a language he'd finally learned to speak. She leaned into him without a word, and in that space, without an audience, without a storm, they understood what it meant to choose each other again. Not as a gesture, not as survival, but as the quiet, consistent act of love lived out in real time. There was something sacred about the ordinary. Layla stood barefoot on the cool kitchen tiles, her fingers sticky with sugar, cinnamon clinging to the hem of her sleeve. The scent of baking filled the space, warm and golden, curling into the high ceilings and dancing beneath the soft hum of the jazz record spinning from the corner. She hadn't planned to make cinnamon rolls. It was the kind of late where people usually crawled into bed or caught up on unread texts. But the urge had come suddenly, quiet but insistent. And without thinking, she'd opened the drawer where the flour lived and started mixing. Behind her, Ethan padded into the room, still in the clothes he'd worn since morning. Dark sweater, sleeves pushed to the elbows, his hair tousled with the kind of casual disarray that only arrived when he forgot the world was watching. He didn't speak. He just leaned in his doorway, watching her from beneath heavy lashes, a glass of water in his hand, and something unreadable in his gaze. She didn't turn around, but she knew he was smiling. "How long do I have to wait before I can steal one?" he asked. Layla smirked over her shoulder. 20 minutes. And if you burn your mouth again, I'm not playing nurse this time." He came closer, slow and quiet, like he didn't want to interrupt whatever spell had been cast in flour and heat. "You only say that," he said, "because you like having the upper hand." She handed him the spatula. "It's nice to keep you humble." They moved around each other easily now, with a rhythm born of repetition, not mechanical, but familiar. He set the table without being asked. She poured the milk without checking if they had enough. When the timer rang, she pulled the tray out with a grace that only came from having burned herself too many times to count. They sat side by side at the kitchen island, devouring the first rolls silently. The moment had no agenda, no performance, just soft dough, shared warmth, and breath sinking between bites. Later, when the plates were empty and the room dipped into a hush, Layla leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I used to think this kind of quiet meant something was missing." He turned his face toward her hair, breathing her in. "And now? Now it means we finally made room for what matters." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. In the months since everything nearly unraveled, their world had grown smaller. Not diminished, just more intentional. Ethan stepped further back from public life. He still invested and advised, but the spotlight no longer tempted him as it once did. He no longer needed applause. He had her. Layla continued her work at the clinic 3 days a week. The rest of her time, she gave to the canvas. The attic-turned studio became her sanctuary. Windows flung open to let in the scent of pine and rain. Her hands constantly smudged with color. Ethan had once asked her what she painted when no one was watching, and she'd said, "What I remember feeling before the world told me how to feel it." The answer stuck with him. One morning, he found her asleep in the studio, curled on the chaise beneath a blanket, the smell of oil paints and rosemary clinging to her skin. A half-finished canvas stood in the center of the room. Broad strokes of rust and teal. 2 abstract figures, suspended mid-motion. He didn't wake her. Instead, he sat in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched her breathe. Time slowed in those moments. Like when a man realizes he's not just in love, he's home. They celebrated their first New Year's with bare feet and cheap champagne. No parties, no photos, just them. Dancing in the living room to a playlist of songs they'd never shared with anyone else. She wore one of his shirts. He wore a paper crown she found at a dollar store. When the clock struck midnight, he kissed her. Not as if he was starting something, but returning to the one thing that never had to end. Their world wasn't glamorous. There were laundry days, headaches, forgotten grocery lists, and arguments about whether or not soup counted as a meal. There were nights when she doubted her purpose, days when he feared disappearing behind her resilience. But still, they chose. They chose each other in the mess, in the motion, in the motionlessness. Sometimes, after long days, they'd sit on the back porch with nothing to say. The silence between them didn't demand to be filled. It stretched, warm and familiar, like an old coat that still fit just right. On one of those nights, Layla turned to him and asked, "Do you ever wish it had all happened differently?" Ethan considered the question, then shook his head. "No," he said, "because if it had, I might not have become the man who deserves this version of you." She pressed her cheek to his chest, her eyes closed, her breath steady. In the quiet that followed, a dog barked 2 streets over. Wind rustled the leaves. Somewhere, someone argued on the sidewalk. But none of it reached them. Because in a world that applauded spectacle, they had chosen something softer, something real. A life measured not in headlines, but in the quiet weight of shared mornings. A love that didn't need to be explained, only lived. The studio smelled of turpentine and bergamot. Afternoon light slipped lazily through the tall windows, golden and diffuse. Dust suspended mid-air like memories refusing to settle. Layla stood before a canvas, brush poised mid-stroke, her other hand resting on her hip. The painting had no title, not yet. It was abstract. Bodies suggested in movement. Color bleeding into color, like breath into breath. She stepped back and narrowed her eyes. There were things she could name in it. Grief, Maybe. Surrender. A slight edge of peace. But the center was still uncertain, and for Layla, uncertainty always meant she wasn't ready to stop painting. Downstairs, Ethan moved through the house quietly, his phone pressed to his ear, and his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His voice, low and steady, filtered through the vents. A hum rather than a presence. Even when negotiating million-dollar decisions, there was a softness to how he carried himself now, as if even ambition had learned to exhale. When he hung up, he didn't call up to her. Instead, he waited. And when she finally came down an hour later, smeared in raw umber, hair tied up with a paint-streaked bandana, he was sitting at the kitchen counter, 2 bowls of tomato bisque already steaming between them. She smiled, her expression the same as when finishing a line of poetry in her head, or finding a lost earring behind the couch. "You remembered the grilled cheese," she said. He looked up. "Do I look like a man who forgets cheese?" She laughed and slid into the seat across from him. They ate with that easy rhythm from memorizing the other's pauses. When to speak and let silence settle. In the pause after the first bite, Ethan set his spoon down and reached into his shirt pocket. Layla raised an eyebrow. "You bought me another necklace?" He shook his head, slowly, and pulled out a folded piece of thick, textured paper. She took it from his hand and unfolded it carefully. It wasn't jewelry. It was a deed. Her name was listed first. Layla Bennett. She read the address once, then again. "You bought a gallery?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ethan tilted his head. "Not exactly. I bought a space. You're going to fill it." She blinked at him, stunned into stillness. "It's yours," he said gently. "To curate, to create in, to invite the world in, on your terms." Her throat tightened. She placed the paper down like it might break. "I never asked for this," she whispered. "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." He didn't move toward her, just sat there, letting her hold the moment in her hands like a living thing. Layla stared at him, overwhelmed not by the gift, but by the knowing. He hadn't just remembered she painted. He remembered why she painted, who she became when she painted. Later that night, they visited the space together. It was still rough. Brick walls, exposed beams, uneven floorboards that creaked beneath every step. But the bones were good. The light was perfect. And in the center of the room, surrounded by nothing but dust and silence, stood a single object, a framed photograph. Layla strolled toward it. She didn't recognize it at first, not because she hadn't lived it, but because it was too quiet to have ever been captured. It was from their wedding night. Not the ceremony, not the kiss, but hours later, when they stood in the kitchen barefoot, her veil folded on the counter, Ethan holding her hand as if steadying her in the hush of something too new to name. She stared at it for a long time. When she turned around, Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "This is yours," he said again. "No one else's, not even mine." She didn't cry, not yet, but she walked toward him, placed her palm against his chest, and whispered, "You see me in ways I never thought possible." "I try," he replied, his voice catching. "I try." And in that quiet, beneath string lights someone else had strung years ago, Layla kissed him, not with gratitude, not with obligation, but with the kind of love that only grows when someone builds a sanctuary out of the parts of you that the world forgets to celebrate. The gallery opened 3 months later. No press release, no launch party, just an invitation list of 30 names, handwritten by Layla herself. The exhibit was called hinges, and every piece whispered of movement, pressure, and small moments holding everything together. People didn't just stare at the art. They lingered. They asked questions. They wept without understanding why. And when they left, many of them did so more slowly than when they arrived, because something about the space refused to let them remain unchanged. That night, after everyone had gone, Layla stood in the middle of the gallery, barefoot again, arms crossed, the light from the windows bathing her in silver. Ethan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You created something real," he said. She tilted her head back to rest against his shoulder. "No," she murmured. "We did." In the quiet that followed, he whispered in her ear, "There's still more to build." And she whispered back, "Then let's do it in the dark, in the quiet, in all the places no one else looks." Because real love isn't found in declarations. It's found in the spaces we carve for one another when no one else is watching. And in that dimly lit room, surrounded by brushstrokes and breath, they stood in the kind of silence that only exists between people who have learned not just to survive together, but to begin again. The rooftop hadn't changed. The string lights were still uneven, draped across rusted nails and wind-worn beams. The chipped paint on the old railing still flaked like sunburnt skin. And in the far corner, the blanket they'd once danced on remained tucked inside a storage bin Ethan never bothered to clean out. Time had brushed across the space, but it hadn't swept it away. Layla stepped out first. The city stretching beneath her like a lullaby hummed just under her breath. The air held that in-between stillness, caught between the warmth of spring and the hush of early evening. She removed her shoes and let her toes press against the cool concrete. The floor remembered them, somehow, or maybe she just remembered herself better here. Ethan followed, slower now, as if the rooftop asked for reverence. He carried 2 glasses and a bottle of wine chilled just enough to make her smile. He'd been quiet all afternoon, not distant, but inward. Like a thought, he hadn't decided whether to speak aloud. They didn't say anything right away. They just sat. Layla pulled the blanket over her lap. Ethan stretched his legs out and leaned on one elbow, watching the horizon instead of her, though she knew he was listening. He always was. Below them, the city glowed without urgency. The skyline blinked like it had nowhere else to be. She tilted her head toward the clouds. "It feels smaller from here," she murmured. "The city?" "No," she said. "The noise." Ethan turned to her, searching her profile. "Maybe we've just gotten louder than it." Layla laughed under her breath, not because it was funny, but because it was true in a way only time could reveal. They sat in silence, which only belonged to people who'd fought their way back to each other, not once, but repeatedly, and found that every time, it was still worth it. After a while, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not thick like a contract, not elegant like a letter, just plain and worn and creased at the edges. He handed it to her without looking. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was his, blocky, a little uneven. There were no flourishes, just a list. "Things I forgot until you. I like slow mornings. I used to believe in grace. Music sounds better in kitchens. Grief doesn't make me smaller. I don't have to win every room. I still want to be chosen. I still want to choose." Layla didn't say anything. She pressed her fingers against the page, tracing his pen's indentations. "You wrote this a long time ago," she said. He nodded. "Before the gallery, before the storm passed." She looked at him then, truly looked, the way someone does, when they know they're not just seeing a person, but the weight they've carried. Why now? Because, Ethan said, voice softer than wind. This is the first time I've felt like I can give it to you without asking for anything back. Her throat tightened. She folded the list again, carefully, and placed it inside her coat pocket, as if it were made of glass. Then she leaned toward him, brushing her lips gently against his temple. You don't have to be perfect, she whispered. You just have to keep remembering. They kissed like that, slow and reverent. Not for heat, but for anchoring, for reminding. His hands cradled her waist like something sacred, and she melted into him with the ease of someone who no longer questioned where she belonged. Afterward, they lay down on the blanket, heads tilted toward the stars. Neither of them spoke, but Layla reached out and laced her fingers through his, palm against palm, and in that small, unassuming gesture, the entire world softened around them. I brought something too, she said suddenly. He turned his head slightly. Yeah? She pulled a tiny object from her coat pocket, a smooth stone, no larger than a quarter. Flat, cool. Its surface had been painted, half blue, half white, with a thin gold line splitting the middle. I painted it the day we fought, she said. The day I left. He looked at it, silent. It's the line between breaking and bending, she said. I didn't know which side we were going to land on, but I didn't want to forget the moment we were both about to snap. He took the stone gently, turned it in his hand. Then he set it on the railing beside them. Let's leave it here, he said. Layla smiled. So the roof remembers too? So we do, he replied. The stars blinked above them. The city murmured below, and between them sat a painted stone and a folded list, two artifacts of love that weren't loud, but were undeniably real. They lay there for a long time, wrapped in wind and history. Eventually, Ethan whispered, Do you still believe in second chances? Layla answered without hesitation. No, not anymore. He tensed slightly. She turned her head, looked into his eyes, and added, Because I don't think we're on our second. We're still writing our first. It's just braver now. He closed his eyes, not to hide, but to feel it more fully. And in the quiet, with no need for rescue or redemption, they held each other, not as people trying to repair something broken, but as two souls brave enough to keep building what never stopped being worth it. Sunday morning unfolded like a hush before a song. The sky outside wore a soft robe of early light that filtered through windows in long golden ribbons, casting every room in a quiet promise. The kettle whistled once inside the kitchen, before Layla turned off the stove. She moved slowly, deliberately, barefoot, hair still damp from the shower, wearing one of Ethan's button-downs she'd long since claimed as her own. Ethan was already at the breakfast table, flipping through a medical journal with furrowed brows, coffee forgotten at his side. The way his brow tensed while reading made her smile. The same expression he used when trying to decipher a new recipe or a piece of abstract art he swore he understood. You still do that thing, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. He looked up. What thing? That looks like you're decoding the universe. He smirked. Maybe I am. She poured tea into her cup, then reached across the table and stole a piece of toast from his plate. He didn't protest. He never did. There was something sacred about how their days had settled, no longer reaching or proving and just existing in quiet companionship. It was the kind of life neither of them had known how to want until they'd lived it. I have to tell you something, she said after a long silence. He closed the journal and leaned back, his eyes attentive. I'm not the same woman you met that night, she said softly, stirring her tea. I'm softer now, slower. He studied her momentarily, then gently tilted her chin with 2 fingers. "You're stronger," he said. "And I'm exactly who I was supposed to become because I loved you." Her throat caught, just slightly. She looked down, suddenly undone by the sincerity of a gaze that never asked her to shrink, only to stay. They didn't speak for a while after that. Instead, they moved through the rhythm of the day. Grocery runs with a shared list, laundry folded between small sips of wine, a half-hour nap tangled in each other's limbs on the couch, while an old record played in the background. Later that evening, they sat on the living room floor, surrounded by paint samples and brush sets Layla had collected for an upcoming workshop at the gallery. She was organizing the colors by tone. Ethan, predictably, was trying to find the logic in a system she swore was intuitive. "This is mauve?" he asked, holding up a swatch. "It's dusty rose," she replied. "Same thing." She gave him a look. "That's like saying jazz and blues are the same thing. They both sound like heartbreak." She paused, considering. "Okay, maybe a little." He leaned in then, close enough that his breath brushed her cheek. "You know what I never told you?" "What?" "That you scared the hell out of me." She turned toward him, surprised. "Why?" "Because," he said, "you didn't need anything from me. Not my name, not my world. You just saw me. And I didn't know how to be seen like that without falling apart." Her smile softened. "You didn't fall apart. I did," he whispered. "But you stayed." Their foreheads touched. He kissed her, slow and deep, not with the heat of urgency, but with the weight of knowing. The kind of kiss that remembers everything. The leaving, the returning, the days when love felt too fragile to name. And when they pulled apart, Layla whispered, "You didn't have to earn me." "I know," he said, "but I still wanted to be worth you." That night, as rain tiptoed against the windows, they curled up on the bed with books they wouldn't finish, fingers that wandered like they were still learning the terrain of each other's skin. There was no urgency, no choreography, just reverence. Layla pressed her lips to the inside of his wrist, the hollow of his collarbone, the scar beneath his rib, which he never liked explaining. Ethan traced her back with the tenderness of someone rebuilding a home brick by brick, not because it was broken, but because it deserved to be cared for. Their bodies moved not with desperation, but with a quiet fluency, breath meeting breath, hesitation unraveling beneath each exhale. They loved each other the way morning glories open, slowly, fully, toward the light. Afterward, they lay in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, the city a distant murmur beyond the glass. Ethan brushed his thumb across her cheek. "I still can't believe you're real sometimes." Layla smiled, half asleep. "I feel the same way." He pulled her closer, her head against his chest, and she closed her eyes to the sound of his heartbeat, steady, certain, hers. And in that moment, with the quiet wrapped around them like a second skin, they didn't need a single word. Because some love stories aren't written in grand gestures or thunderclaps. Some are painted in the softest shades of being known, and still, again and again, being chosen. Spring arrived without announcement, not in a rush of blossoms or grand changes, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. The shift in the wind's warmth, the quiet persistence of green creeping up along the edges of sidewalks, the sudden clarity of the sky just before dusk. Ethan noticed it when Layla opened the windows again, letting the breeze curl through the house and carrying the scent of lilacs and wet earth. He saw it in her laugh too, looser now, like her body had finally stopped bracing for some unnamed storm. Their days had settled into a rhythm as delicate as breath. It wasn't choreographed. It didn't need to be. They met each morning with the simplicity of two people who had made peace with not rushing, not reaching, just being. And then, one day, Layla said, almost absently over tea, "I want to go back to the rooftop." Ethan looked up. "The gallery?" "No," she said, her voice quieter now. "That rooftop, the one where we danced without music, where we remembered how to be us." So they went. It wasn't an occasion. There was no fanfare, no crowd. Just a soft Thursday evening and a few friends who understood that not all vows need witnesses, only intention. Layla wore midnight blue. The dress hugged her softly, folding and falling like ink spilled slowly. Her curls were swept back, pinned with a single silver comb. Ethan wore a white button-down, with sleeves rolled casually to the elbow, no tie, and bare wrists. He looked like a man who had stopped apologizing for being vulnerable. There were no chairs, no arch, no aisle, just the same creaky floorboards beneath their feet and the string lights that had once flickered above their heads like quiet constellations. Renee stood a few paces away, her hand clasped gently around a small notebook. She didn't read from it. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "You've already made the choice. This is just the moment you repeat it." Layla turned to Ethan first. She didn't pull out paper. She didn't clear her throat. Her voice was steady, shaped by all the silences that had brought her here. "You loved me before I believed I was worth loving," she said. "You saw light in places I was taught to keep hidden, and you didn't try to fix them. You just stayed." She paused. "I vow to keep choosing you, especially on the days we're both tired of being strong. I vow to speak gently, even when I'm scared. I vow to reach for your hand, even in the dark." Ethan's jaw was tight when he replied. Not from nerves, from the way love sits heavy in the chest when it's finally allowed to land. "You made me stop chasing perfection," he said. "You made me want real. With you, I learned how to be quiet without retreating. I learned how to lose without disappearing. I vow to be the man who keeps showing up, for the small things, for the messy ones, for the morning after a bad dream and the Tuesday night where we do nothing but sit in silence." Layla's lips trembled, but she smiled. They didn't kiss immediately. They just stood there, inches apart, eyes open. The city hushed below them, like a child listening through a cracked door. When their hands finally met, it wasn't for show. It was instinct, a tether. They kissed once, not for applause, but because their mouths already knew the shape of home. Later that night, back in their bedroom, candlelight softened the edges of everything. The world felt smaller again, on purpose. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, watching Layla as she undressed, slowly and without performance. Her skin glowed gold beneath the flickering light. She moved like she trusted herself now. He stood and walked to her, letting his fingers trail along her spine. She turned, bare in every sense, and reached for him, not to possess, but to invite. They made love with reverence, like opening a gift meant to be unwrapped slowly. He traced the curve of her shoulder. She kissed the scar near his ribs. Their bodies reacquainted with the ease of memory and the hunger of beginning again. There was no rush, no script, only the quiet rhythm of rediscovery. When they stilled, tangled in sheets and breath, Layla whispered into his chest, "You know what I realized tonight?" He kissed her hair. "What?" "We never had a fairy tale." "No," he murmured. "We had something harder and better." He nodded, holding her tighter. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, gentle, like a reminder. The kind that doesn't threaten, only says, "You've been through worse." and you're still here. And inside, wrapped in cotton and skin and quiet forgiveness, they were more than still here. They were together, not in defiance of the world, but because they had written a new one, between the broken and the beautiful, between the ache and the ease. Love is not measured by the height of its flame, but by how often it keeps burning, even when the wind tries its best to put it out. The seasons continued their quiet choreography, one folding gently into the next. Summer lingered a little longer than usual that year. The sunlight was generous, and the rain was warm and brief. In the mornings, the city breathed slowly, and in the evenings, it exhaled into golden dusks that painted windows and sidewalks alike. And in the heart of a quiet neighborhood, just off a tree-lined street, Layla and Ethan's home stood like a secret kept safe by time. Inside, life was no longer extraordinary. But that was the miracle. Layla stood by the nursery window, the soft curve of her belly now unmistakable beneath the linen dress she wore. One hand rested there, as if in conversation with the quiet life growing inside her. The other traced the windowsill where the sun warmed the wood. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Behind her, Ethan approached with the gentleness of a man who had learned repeatedly that love was not about grand declarations, but presence. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I felt a kick," she said, smiling. Ethan smiled too, his hand covering hers, already ready to make an entrance. Layla leaned into him, her eyes still on the sky. "You ever think about how none of this was supposed to happen?" she asked. "All the time. And yet, here we are." They stood that way for a while, two souls who had risked their undoing and somehow found each other intact, still in love, still willing. That afternoon, they planted the lemon tree. It was a quiet ritual. No ceremony, no audience. Their hands were in the dirt. Sunlight caught in Layla's curls, and Ethan read the instructions like it was the most crucial text he'd ever held. They picked the far corner of the yard, where the sun hit longest in the afternoon, and where, years ago, a swing used to hang from a crooked beam. "This tree will take time," Layla said. "Everything good does," Ethan replied. Layla knelt and whispered something to the soil as they watered the roots. Ethan didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. Some things were meant to be spoken just once, and to the earth. Later they sat on the porch steps, sipping lemonade and watching the sky paint itself into dusk. There was music playing faintly inside. Miles Davis, perhaps? Or maybe something Layla had composed and never admitted to finishing. The dog, an aging rescue named Harper, stretched across their feet, sighing with the kind of peace only creatures without clocks knew how to keep. And at that moment, they didn't talk about the next day, or the hospital bag waiting by the door, or the fact that their lives were about to change all over again. They just breathed. The story they'd lived wasn't one for headlines. It didn't glitter. It didn't burn too bright. But it stayed. It rooted. It softened. And in the quiet space between their joined hands, it bloomed. Chapter. If you've walked this journey with us, from the pain of beginnings to the quiet grace of becoming, then you already know. This wasn't a rescue story, or perfection, or fairy tale love. It was about choosing. Again, even when the past threatened to pull them under, even when pride said, "Leave," and fear said, "Don't try again." Layla and Ethan chose. They chose to trust what was fragile, to believe in what had already been broken, to build something beautiful, not despite the cracks, but because of them. And maybe you've loved like this. Maybe you've lost like this. Perhaps you've stood at the edge of something that felt like too much and too late. And maybe, just maybe, you stayed. If so, then this story belongs to you too. Because some of the most authentic love stories aren't the loudest. They're the ones that grow in silence, in forgiveness, in second chances you didn't think you deserved but took anyway. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a time, a person, a part of yourself you thought was gone, I'd be honored if you'd like to comment or follow this channel. Not for applause, but to remind the world, love doesn't have to be flawless to be worth everything. Sometimes, it just has to be real.